these arguments, unlike the ontological argument, are, as we said, a posteriori. You'll see the word post meaning after. In other words, after and based on experience of the world. And Aquinas, along with Guanillo, didn't really think that the ontological argument did the job. But Aquinas was very influenced by Aristotle because, frankly, what happened was some of the early church liked Plato. Now, earlier I tried to mention that Augustine tried to synthesize Christian views with Platonic metaphysics and was probably the most successful at it, but that there were several attempts in the first century to do this with the Gnostics that were actually, and they produced resultant theologies that ended up being considered heretical, mostly because they denied the literalness of the central Christian doctrine of the Incarnation. So, so the early church seemed to like the otherworldliness of Platonic metaphysics, but they were very uneasy with Aristotle's down-to-earth, very scientific approach to things. And, you know, in the book of Acts, you see people burning books, and I suspect that among the books that were burned were some of the works of Aristotle, because they were literally lost to the Western world for nearly 1,000 years, maybe even more than 1,000 years, until about the 11th century, the 11 or 1200s, when the Crusades went down to the Holy Land. They rediscovered these works, preserved in the Arab world, and brought them back to Europe. And so Aquinas was very influenced by Aristotelian thought. And what is called the first way is really just a rehashing of an argument that Aristotle used to try to prove the existence of his version of an impersonal God. You know, as I think your book points out, Aristotle's prime mover is maybe self-occupied with contemplating his own perfection, but unlike the traditional Judeo-Christian Islamic concept of God as a personal God who's involved in our lives from day to day, Aristotle's prime mover was closer to the force of Star Wars, a sort of causative force that got everything going, but not really a God who's involved in our everyday lives. And now, for Aquinas, he's going to go off not just Aristotle, but the Bible and church tradition over, 1,000 years. And so, for Aquinas, if there's a conclusion at the end of these arguments that says God exists, it's not going to be Aristotle's impersonal prime mover. It's going to be basically, for him, the God of the Bible and church tradition. Now, a lot of theologians kind of look at, I don't know, the way I describe their attitude toward these arguments from natural philosophy, natural theology, is that they're kind of icing on the cake. Most theologians, would not consider their own faith to be based on these arguments. Now, David Hume, when he criticizes them, in the late 1700s, besides bringing skeptical critiques against very conservative believers, David Hume, as a skeptic, also tries to argue against the deists, people like Jefferson, who weren't too enamored with stories of miracles. It's reported that Jefferson made his own copy of the New Testament and he cut out all the parts having to do with miracles. But they wanted a faith entirely founded upon reason as opposed to revelation and authority. But the point that Hume makes, and it's worth pointing out at the onset, is that even if some of these arguments go through, and at most they would show that it's more probable than not that God exists. They're probabilistic arguments. They don't show God's existence with the certainty of a mathematical axiom as the ontological argument is claimed to do. But the point is, if like Aquinas and other theologians, you look at these as just kind of supplements to your overall belief system, then they don't have to stand on their own 2 feet and sort of do the job on their own. But if you're going to be like the deists, like the intellectuals of Jefferson's day, and say, well, I want an entirely rationally based faith, then there's a real question about whether these arguments can be made to stand on their own 2 feet, because while they may prove that like the first 3 are meant to show that a first cause is necessary for all things, to jump from there and go where Aquinas wants to go, that which I'm sure for him is the only realistic option, but that that the first cause is basically the God of the Bible and church tradition, is a big jump. And this is one of the things that David Hume pointed out, that even if the arguments work, they don't necessarily show that the first cause is what Aquinas wants them to be. So, so they go only so far. And again, it depends on how you view them. But the first way is very much a reworking of Aristotle's argument, as I said, for a prime mover. And so what's the observation? Well, we look around, and I think the video did a good job of coming up with a graphic that illustrates this. Was shown, I think, a brook. Right? You look around and things are in motion. Things change. We saw that with Heraclitus. Now, for Aristotle, you had potential and actual motion. And really, we preserve some of this even today. Now, believe it or not, I mean, we had physics when I went to Poly. Physics was around. And I remember, even then we talked about the difference between potential motion. If you have a pen sitting there, it's got potential energy, and you kick it off, and now it's, got kinetic or actual, energy that's expended, or motion. Well, Aristotle talks about motion going from potentiality to actuality in a number of different ways. So, this is this slide. Again, your book only has the second way, but this is actually Aquinas' own illustration. He says, well, you look at wood for a fireplace and it's potentially hot. But then if you light it, and build a fire, then it becomes actually hot. So you've got the transition from potentiality to actuality. And of course you can see causation coming into play here. But Aquinas agrees with Aristotle's claim that something has to be one or the other, but it can't be both. In other words, something has to be potentially in motion or actually in motion, but it can't be both at the same time in the same place. Wood can't be actually hot and potentially hot simultaneously in the same place, right? Yeah, we can have a log where some of it's burning and it's actually hot, but the fire hasn't gotten to the other side of the log, and that side's potentially hot. But that's not what he's talking about. We're talking about the same in the same place at the same time. Now, let me see. Somebody's got Aristotelian ethics going on here. Dots is therefore. All of these three first arguments have the same overall strategy. It's the same strategy you find in 100 bottles of beer on a wall. Take one down and pass it around. You only got 99. This is it's what logicians call a disjunctive argument or a disjunctive syllogism. A disjunctive argument uses or. And it's the same kind of reasoning that a doctor uses to diagnose something. Okay, I think the problem here is A or B or C, so let's now do some tests to see if we can eliminate some of these options. Okay, we've done test 1 and we've eliminated B, so now it's either A or C. Okay, let's run another test that might eliminate one A or C. Okay, we eliminated C, so it must be A. And the same type of logic is used with a mechanic trying to diagnose a problem in your car, or a computer technician trying to figure out what's causing, a computer to malfunction. So, this is a type of argument that's used a lot, even in ordinary situations. And this is what Aquinas' general approach is going to be. He's going to try to say, well, there are several possibilities, right? The universe, like Plato thought, could be eternal and doesn't need a first cause. Or things could somehow bring themselves into existence. So we don't need a first cause at the beginning of everything. Or we do need a first cause. The universe has a finite beginning, and we need a first cause to get things going. And so his strategy in all three of these arguments is to basically say, well, we have these options, let's try to eliminate some of them. And of course, I don't have to tell you where he ends up, right? The option he wants is, we need a necessary first cause, namely God, of all things. So here's the first option, that things could bring themselves into motion. In other words, what do we talk about? We're talking about basically a causal chain that begins with what you look around now and see and observe. And he's saying, we'll look around, these things are actually in motion. And now either there's a causal chain where things set themselves in motion, or the universe is eternal. But now, to eliminate the first possibility, he says, well, look, things didn't just set themselves in motion. Why? Because it would mean that they would, in order to move themselves, they'd have to be actually in motion. But in order to need to be put into motion, they would have to be potentially in motion. So they'd have to be actually and potentially in motion at the same time, which is a contradiction. So he says, whatever is moved then doesn't move itself, but it has to be moved by something besides itself. But now, so the second option, and remember, Plato did not think that the world was finite, that the universe was finite. He thought matter was as eternal as the forms. It just was always around. Plato's concept of an impersonal God, what he called the demiurge, is just a God that does not create everything, like Genesis 1 says, ex nihilo, from nothing. But Plato's concept of a God was of a being that puts form and matter together to form the material world we live in. But matter, for Plato, was always around. Well, Aquinas says this is problematic. What do you know about an infinite series? Does it have a first member? Well, you're correct. You're shaking your head, but right. I mean, an infinite series supposedly has no first member of the series. I mean, the concept of infinity can really mess your head up, right? True story, my first year in graduate school, there was a guy, and I forget whether he was also in his first year of graduate school or he was an upper level undergrad. And I went a year to the University of Kentucky before I transferred to Virginia. And he said, well, he was in mathematics at a pretty advanced level. And he said, you know what, I was in this class, and they told me that it's theoretically possible to have an object that has a finite surface area but an infinite volume. In other words, if something's infinite, you can't even do anything with it in principle. So he said, in principle, you could paint it, but you'd never fill it up. And he said, when I heard that, I decided to jump ship from mathematics and get into something a little more solid and down to earth. So he went into philosophy, which, you know, I guess we could question the wisdom of that decision, but believe me, this is not the kind of thing you can make up. But I think infinity and some of the complications with the notion of infinity apparently was so problematic to him that he thought, I want to go somewhere where I don't have to deal with getting my mind around these problems. Well, the point is, Aquinas has to deal with the other possibility. So now he's X'd out the possibility that things bring themselves or move themselves, because he said that's a contradiction. But he says, well, what if the universe were just infinite and we didn't need any first mover, any cause round? Well, he says if the universe was infinite, there would not be a first mover because there's no first member of an infinite series. But he's convinced that without a first mover, you wouldn't have anything moved in between, and you wouldn't have the current world. And he brings this out a little bit better in his second way, where he discusses efficient causes, which are basically causes the way you and I know to talk about causes. You know, so he says there wouldn't be any subsequent movers. So he says everything can't be infinite, because then you wouldn't have any intermediate movers, and you wouldn't have what you have today. So he says, well, let's take the third possibility, and that's that things don't move themselves. The universe is not infinite, but we, of necessity, need a first mover to get it all going. And of course, for him, the only legitimate option, and here he's bringing more, revelation and church tradition into play than abstract philosophy. So the only legitimate candidate for him would be the God of the Bible and church tradition. Well, the second way. Now, your book is a little wrong here, and I emphasize the fact that the second way is a cosmological argument, but really all three of these first ways, way 1, 2, and 3, they're all versions of the cosmological argument, couched in slightly different language. But I think the reason your book use his second way is that the notion of cause he uses is Aristotle's notion of an efficient cause, which is pretty much cause as we mean cause today. See, Aristotle had formal and final causes, where the form of a thing somehow causes it to be what it is, or a final cause. If you're talking about the causes that come into play to make an acorn grow into an oak tree, besides the efficient causes of, the plant over its life taking in nourishment and sunlight and photosynthesis happening, and all the story that a biologist would tell now about efficient causes, Aristotle, in addition to that, says, but the acorn aims at the oak tree as its final or teleological, cause. And so you've got the final cause kind of pulling it toward, in the whole process, toward being an oak tree. Well, it's interesting, your book says even after William of Ockham, but certainly after Newton, we don't talk about Aristotle's formal and final causes as being there in nature, these built-in purposes. But we do talk about efficient causes. So an efficient cause produces its effect, right? So somebody had to heat this up. This is my McCoffee, to get it to brew. And So, so we know if we look around, we see that things produce effects. You know, there are causes in this world that produce effects. And of course, the big deal about efficient causes is they precede their effects in time, right? Somebody had to put a fire under the water or turn on the coffee pot before it heated the water, you know. But now, here's the thing. If efficient causes have to precede their effects in time, then, and here he uses the same strategy. He says, well, could things just be their own efficient cause? Well, he says, because why? Well, he says, if efficient causes precede their effects in time, then for a thing to be the efficient cause of itself, it would have to exist before it exists, which is a, you know, nonsense, which is a contradiction. It would have to exist before itself in time, or as I said, would have to exist prior to itself. And so this would be an impossibility, a contradiction. So he says, okay, let's eliminate this possibility. Things don't bring themselves into existence. But here again, he goes to the second possibility that everything's just infinite and we don't need a first cause. But he has basically the same reasoning going on. You know, again, he says the process can't go on to infinity because then there would be no first cause, FC. But if there's no first cause, then, and what this symbolizes is sort of a timeline, where this is what's going on now, what you can see around you in the world, and you've got a first cause at the beginning of it all, but producing intermediate, you know, causes that cause other things, you know, finally ending. I don't know why this thing keeps on. You know, finally ending in what we have now. So, so he says that you had to have a first cause. But again, you would say, well, why is that so? If the universe were just infinite, it would be there as an infinitely existing thing, and it didn't need a first cause. So he says, if we take away the cause, we take away the effect. So he says, if you assume things are infinite, then you need no first cause, so you take away the first cause. But if you take away the first cause, then you take away all the intermediate causes and effects leading up the causal chain to where we are today. And then if we're the ultimate effect of things, you take away us too. So since something exists, he says we can't have an infinite chain. So he says, you know, if the causal chain were infinite, then there would be no first cause, but no intermediate causes, and we wouldn't have what we have now. So since we do have something, we have to admit a first efficient cause. And here again, of course, he identifies the first efficient cause of all things with God. So you can see that's structured the same. Now, the other one is a little bit different. And I talked about what are called modalities. Modalities are possibility, impossibility, necessity. And that's what comes into play in the third way. The third way, I'm not going to pound this one a lot. It is by far his most complicated argument. and it's one that Leibniz weighed in on with something called the principle of sufficient reason that's mentioned in the video, but they don't say why it's even relevant. So we're not going to worry about that. But basically, to be contingent, in other words, look at the, I call them tables or desks in the room. There's no necessity written into the foundation of the universe that these tables and chairs had to exist, right? Furthermore, they have not eternally existed. They came into existence or were brought into existence, manufactured, at some point in time. And we know that even though they seem to be made relatively well, at some point they're going to wear out and be discarded and maybe melted down or whatever, recycled into something else, but go out of existence. And so contingent things are things that do not exist eternally, and while it was possible that they would exist, and maybe they actually exist, there was no necessity to their existing. They exist, but they might not have existed, right? I mean, you tell a story where no one ever thinks to design, tables like this, so none of them are ever built, easily imaginable. So he says, though, if everything were in this category of where it might not have existed, then at one time nothing would have existed. Now, I didn't take Latin, but I think it's something like ex nihilo est, or something like this. From nothing, nothing comes. Aquinas is convinced that you don't get something from nothing. All right? And you can say, well, that's an undefended assumption in his argument. And some people look at it that way. That he assumes, but doesn't prove, that you can't get something from nothing. And when I was in college, one of the competing theories to the Big Bang theory was what was called the steady state theory, and it was the thought that molecules of matter would just spring into existence, and over eons of time they would form, planets and stars and what have you. But they would essentially come into existence from nothing. Well, if everything is in this category of being contingent, Aquinas is convinced that if we didn't have anything that existed necessarily, then at some point nothing would have existed if we assume that everything in the universe is contingent. And again, I have a problem with this. Why couldn't you have an infinite string of contingent existences? But at any rate, he's absolutely convinced that that would be the case. So if at one time nothing exists, then nothing would have begun to exist, so nothing would exist now. Again, he builds in this assumption that you can't get something from nothing. So he says, since something does exist now, we have to assume that not everything that exists is merely contingent, that there is at least one necessary being, and he wants this being to be a being that doesn't derive its necessity from any other being. Now I leave out a big, complicated step in his argument, and I think he might have angels in mind or something, but he says, well, you could have necessary beings who derive their necessity, their necessary existence, from some other being, but they're not self-sufficiently necessary. But he says, and so he thinks he has to eliminate a string of necessary beings that get their necessity from another being. Now, look, I'm not going to ask you anything like that on a test. I don't know why he thinks he has to make that move. But at any rate, he's convinced that at the beginning of it all, we have to have at least one self-sufficient, necessary being. And of course, that self-sufficiently necessary being would be God. And this sort of answers the question. Some people have problems with this because they say, well, doesn't this just push the problem back one level? If we say, well, why does the universe exist? Well, it needed a cause. And who was the cause of the universe? God. But then, this is the kind of question a 5-year-old asks, but who caused God to exist? Well, of course, in an argument like this, the argument is that God is self-sufficiently necessary and does not need a cause to bring God into existence. So the self-sufficiently necessary being is God. But here again, I'll reiterate that there's a big step taken at the end by Aquinas to go from there must be a first cause of all things to the first cause of all things is the God of the Bible and church tradition. If you just look at these arguments by themselves, David Hume pointed out that a lot of things are possible. He says, look at how messed up the world is. Maybe rather than the perfect God who's, that fits the description we saw in the ontological argument, why couldn't the maker of the universe be some inept, inferior God who, like somebody taking their first pottery course, makes his first try at a world and says, you know what, I really botched that one. Let me throw this one away and move on to something else, and we're left with a result. It's not that David Hume as a skeptic really thinks that that's the case, but he says it's a hypothetical possibility. Or he says, couldn't the universe have been designed by committee? Couldn't we have a committee of lesser deities coming into play here? It isn't, again, that David Hume believed that that was actually the case, but he said, if you're just going from the possibilities that logic lays out there as possibilities that haven't been eliminated as the first cause of all things, Hume says, well, you got to take into account these other things. Now, again, for Aquinas, he's got other views of what he thinks God is from the Bible and church tradition, and he's not going to, take as credible some of Hume's other conjectural possibilities, But if you just look at those arguments by themselves, they don't get you all the way to what you need. Any question? Well, as I said, when I was growing up, the steady state theory was in play. And for a while, even though Hubble had noticed that things are moving away from us, the Hubble, for whom the Hubble telescope was named, that was way back, I think, in about the 1920s. They still had these two battling theories, the Big Bang theory, which says the universe had a finite beginning in time, and the steady state theory, which says no, it kind of always was, and particles of matter come into existence. And I just love stories like this. At Princeton, they were trying to find confirming evidence of the Big Bang. And their theories told them that if it really happened, that there should be, at the outer edges of the universe, a sort of residual amount of signal that should be able to be picked up by a radio telescope. They call it the what was it? Something background radiation. So these highfalutin scientists at Princeton who published a big paper on it in a scientific journal are trying for all they're worth to find confirmatory evidence of this with their equipment, and so far they haven't done. This is like in the 1970s. And so meanwhile, not too far away from there in New Jersey, some engineers are working on a radar system, and they're getting noise in the radar system, and they don't know what it's coming from, and they're trying to eliminate things that are near. There's just noise on the signal. And I've been a ham radio operator since I was 14. I guarantee you don't want too much noise on the signal, or you're not going to be able to hear what you need to hear. And so, they go to lengths like even cleaning the antenna, because part of their theory is that it might be pigeon droppings on the antenna that's causing this noise. But finally, one of them reads this article by Princeton, and they realize, wait a second, this noise that we can't eliminate and that's coming from everywhere is the cosmic background radiation, the residual effects of the Big Bang, and is confirmatory evidence that the Big Bang really happened. And, so these guys, were the first to provide the first real evidence. So that's interesting, right? And everything's moving away from us. But now, every one of us has at some point gone to a fireworks display, right? I like the ones that go all the way up. And the higher they are, the bigger they're going to be. And then you go, boom. But what happens? You get a bang, right? Like the Big Bang theory. But then everything just, sometimes if they're illuminated by another firework, you can see the smoke trails, But all the embers and ashes just kind of, burn out. And all you've got is a little smoke in the sky. Well, even after the Big Bang theory, and this is brought up in the video, became the theory, that didn't eliminate, believe it or not, the claim that maybe the universe is infinite after all. Anybody, now we use this term in radio, what is it for something to oscillate? Anybody? Well, if something oscillates, it goes kind of back and forth. And there was a new way that scientists thought they could still, even in the light of the Big Bang, defend the possibility of an infinite universe. Because what seems to be the assumption of the Big Bang theory that's very consistent with, traditional Judeo-Christian Islamic religion, that the universe, instead of being infinite, had a finite beginning in time at the Big Bang, right? But the thought was maybe what we have is what they called an oscillating universe. In other words, that, and this possibility, remember those videos were shot in about 1998. The thought was you would have a Big Bang, right? And everything would be expanding, as they are now. I mean, that was Hubble's great discovery in the 20s, that the galaxies and all are actually going away from us. But the thought was they would reach a point, kind of like, those old paddle balls where you hit the ball and it would go out, but at some point the rubber thing would pull it back. Well, the thought was that at some point in its expansion, the gravitational fields of the matter in the universe would start pulling everything back together again. And so this is how you would get an infinite universe. You get a Big Bang, everything would be going out, and that's the phase we're in now, but then everything would come together again. Then you get another Big Bang, and it would be oscillating back and forth for time immemorial. Well, the most recent data on that seems to confirm that that ain't going to happen. That the universe is going to be more like the firework that you see, that everything is just going to lose all of its energy and, peter out. That's it. So, in other words, that what was argued so forcefully against the Big Bang theory and the universe having a finite beginning of time, well, the latest evidence seems to claim that the argument that we have an oscillating universe doesn't seem to hold water anymore. The evidence seems to be that the gravitational forces are not going to pull everything back in again at any point in time, and it seems to. Well, okay, the fifth way, the design argument. The simplest argument, in a way, right? Things in nature not having understanding or intelligence, not act toward a goal. Here again we have Aristotle's version of teleological causes, purposes built into nature, which Aquinas picks up. In other words, an acorn can't direct itself, he thinks, toward becoming an oak tree. It had to have been designed to do that. So lacking intelligence, things can't direct themselves toward a goal. And this is Aquinas' own example. He says, without an intelligent archer directing that arrow, it's not going to hit its mark. It's not going to do so by itself. So it has to be directed by an intelligence. Paley, I think, does this better. It's the design argument is really what's called an argument from analogy, where you say things have these properties in common. A and B have these properties in common. So it's likely, or probably, they have at least one more property in common, and there's your conclusion. And Paley gets this out when he talks about finding the watch. He says, well, what made the watch different from the stone? he makes the same point Aquinas makes here, that the watch has a lot of moving parts that move together to accomplish some purpose or goal. In this case, moving the hands so we can tell time, an old-fashioned watch like Paley would have used. And so he says the watch didn't just come by that, from nature. He says it had to have been designed to do that by an intelligent designer. And of course the analogy is, and Paley's big on things like the eye. He says, look at something like the human eye. Isn't it also a complicated mechanism with parts that function together to serve a particular purpose? Well, okay, so there are the things in common between a watch and something like the eye. So he says, well, let's take the next step. If the watch needed a designer in order to be something with moving parts that work together to fulfill a function or purpose, why wouldn't the eye? And who would the designer of the eye be other than God? Now, of course, evolution would tell a story about increasingly, about natural selection and, nature over millions of years selecting the species that had better eyes. And so you'd get this progressive development, that would not require an artificer or a designer, But at any rate, so he says, if you have something that is not an intelligence in and of itself, it needed an external intelligence to design it to fulfill the purpose that it has. And so he says, just like an arrow needs someone, an intelligent director, we need God as designer of all things. Now Hume, one of Hume's criticisms is that the world we actually have is not the kind of world you would think a perfect God would create. Now, you can go into a lot of gyrations talking about that, but it sort of also brings in the problem of evil. But while, Hume did a lot to argue against the design argument, the design argument still remains alive, and the more up-to-date versions tend to point to things like Planck's constant, and this is mentioned in the video, that kind of have to be what they are for life to develop. Another part of the contemporary design argument that was mentioned in a philosophy text I used to use is above us, and this is what we bounce signals off, the ionosphere, very thin belt that shields out some ultraviolet radiation. And the way the contemporary version of the design argument would go is, well, isn't it interesting that if that thin belt were thicker than it is, it would shield out too many ultraviolet rays and life would not flourish down here. On the other hand, if it were thinner, we would have too many ultraviolet rays coming through and lots of cancers, and maybe life wouldn't flourish either. But isn't it interesting that it's exactly the thickness that it needs to be? But here we have kind of a sort of chicken and egg game, right, between the evolutionists and the the arguer for creation. Because an evolutionist can say, well, but wait a second. The species that have survived and thrived over the course of eons have been the species that thrive best with the layer being exactly what it is. So, the debate goes on. But even the design argument has had more subtle, sophisticated versions of it that have been gotten out more recently. Well, any questions? Maybe I just let it run.